On the 7th of July 1598, Francette Camont was executed in the Duchy of Lorraine for demonic witchcraft. She had confessed to having been visited by a demon named Person who had seduced her, and to attending the witches' sabbath, where she acquired the means to perform maleficent magic against her neighbours. The trial was overseen by Nicholas Remy, a famously prolific and convinced witch hunter. Francette came from poverty, having lost her family to disease at a young age. Though she and her husband had managed to build a life in Lorraine, Francette had gained an unsavoury reputation over a period of many years as a result of her somewhat quarrelsome nature. As a result, at her trial, many of her neighbours testified to strange misfortunes that she had seemingly provoked. Not all were convinced she was the culprit. One man only concluded Francette was responsible for his afflictions after consulting with a local cunning woman, and another, who doubted she was responsible for his issues, said that even if she were, he forgave her. Others were less forgiving, convinced that there had to have been an intentional causal link between their arguments with Francette and episodes of injury, disease, and crop failure that followed. But there is little to suggest that Francette was anything more than a slightly cantankerous woman in a community vulnerable to the uncertainty of nature. Under torture, however, Francette testified to attending nocturnal gatherings of witches, obtaining magic powders and knowledge of black magic, and using them to hound her neighbours. She confessed to murder and named accomplices she had met at the Sabbath. After succumbing to the demands of her torturers, she told a familiar story for which for 3 centuries resonated all around Europe, of a demonic cult out to destroy Christendom, which authorities sought to purge. This story may be somewhat familiar, but in the popular imagination, this Kafkaesque nightmare took place in a distant medieval past. Yet in 1598, when Francette was tried, the Crusades were long past, Shakespeare was at the height of his career, and the Renaissance was in full swing. This did not happen against a backdrop of Dark Age obscurantism. By the time the last trials were heard and the statutes against witchcraft were being overturned in the 18th and early 19th centuries, the Middle Ages were a distant, unfamiliar memory, and the scientific and political revolutions that continue to define the world today were well underway. The stereotypical witch as we now know her, the old woman who flies by night to the Sabbath, was a product of the early modern period, the centuries in which Europe moved out of feudalism and theocracy and towards capitalism, republicanism and empiricism. But she would not have been entirely unfamiliar to the ancestors of those that hunted her. As far back as antiquity, the Romans believed in a creature known as the Strix, variably a kind of bird-like monster or an old woman able to transform herself into one at night to engage in cannibalism and poisoning. The link here is more than just symbolic, as the Strix would lend her name to the witch in Latin texts, and the modern Italian word for witch, strega, is derived from this root. Yet no one in Rome was ever arrested for being a Strix. Maleficent magic was a crime in much of pre-modern Europe, yet there were few prosecutions and certainly nothing on the scale of the early modern witch hunt. Illegal lynchings may have happened, but prior to the 15th century it was exceedingly rare for a magic user to be put before a judge, and rarer still for them to implicate others. How, then, is it that a seemingly crude and hysterical episode of bloodletting occurred at a time of radical advances of knowledge? In the medieval period, justice was enacted through a superstitious accusatory system, where judgment was left to fate. The accused would be subjected to trials, such as being burned, from which their recovery time was taken as a sign of innocence or guilt. The upper classes could opt for trial by combat, either as direct participants or through a champion as proxy. Should this process return a verdict of innocence, then suspicion would fall upon the accuser, who may have been subjected to similar trials in order to prove their accusations had been made in good faith. There was little attempt made to formally investigate the alleged crimes, so without the confession of the accused or overwhelming evidence being forthcoming, launching a procedure against someone was a risky venture, which only the most seriously aggrieved were willing to try. In particular, this was a problem for the prosecution of crimes of faith. Christianity had never been without its competitors and heterodox interpretations, and the Church's hegemony over European spiritual life was always fleeting. The combination of low levels of literacy and the Church's insistence that liturgy be carried out in Latin meant that many nominally Christian people understood very little of the faith, and well into the 16th century, missionaries were finding peasants even in the villages surrounding Rome who knew almost nothing of the Church. In this backdrop, it was not hard for alternate interpretations of Scripture to gain a foothold, and in the later medieval period, more organised religious sects became more frequent. The medieval Church was keen to stamp out this growing defiance of its authority, but normal legal procedures left too much to chance. It became necessary to obtain definitive proof, and so the Inquisition was founded. The First Inquisition was created in the 13th century to root out and eliminate the Cathars, a heretical Christian sect in Languedoc and southern France, and subsequently other heretics, including religious minorities that refused to convert, namely Jews. By the early modern period, when the witch trials reached their apex, the Inquisition itself was a more legal than religious body, which was already largely sceptical and produced some of the most striking arguments against the witch hunts. But it was the wider legacy of the Inquisition and its methodology which had enabled them. The Inquisition transferred the responsibility of prosecution from the accusers to the authorities, established strict burdens of proof to be met, and methodology through which to obtain it, which over the last centuries of the medieval period became normalised across most of Europe. By the 16th century, this generally meant either the testimony of two direct witnesses to the crime or the confession of the accused were necessary for conviction in most jurisdictions. Torture could be applied, but under specific rules, and any confession had to be ratified outside of the torture chamber to be considered valid. This system was not universal and had its regional varieties, but it was used in some form or another by both religious and secular authorities, Catholics and Protestants alike, and marked a sharp change in the mentality of the legal system. It made many offences that had previously gone ignored, especially those of a magical or spiritual nature, possible to be dealt with legally. Whilst it was far from the rigours of contemporary law, it was a much more rational, methodical system than medieval law had been. It consolidated a series of assumptions that we now take for granted, that through investigation, the truth of assertions can be ascertained to a reasonable degree from which legal action can be taken. This seeming contradiction goes beyond just witchcraft. Much of the brutal torture methodology that is often ascribed to the Middle Ages was in fact a distinctly modern phenomenon. Creative methods of torture such as the iron chair and brutal public spectacles, executions such as being hanged, drawn and quartered, were primarily the purview of our immediate predecessors and not our distant ancestors. For all they may produce shock today, they are not as anachronistic as they are often described as. Of course, strict application of this system alone did not produce the bloody excess of witch hunting, an episode which saw the execution of around 45,000 people and twice that number of trials. None of these victims ever practiced demonic witchcraft. Whilst in some cases folkloric practices served as stand-ins for actual witchcraft activity, there was no cult of devil worshippers or even unified continent-wide set of practices which were construed as such by the authorities. A legal structure alone could not have produced so many false confessions, but a mandate to prosecute can take a zealot a long way, and judicial oversight was not easy to enforce at a time when neither central states nor their bureaucracies were well developed. Formally, there were strict rules on what kinds of torture could be applied, for how long, and under what circumstances, but in Europe's backwaters, where legal authorities were accountable to almost no one, it was all too easy for these rules to be broken. The bloodiest excesses of the witch hunt occurred in what is now Germany, at the time mostly under the control of the Holy Roman Empire, which was subdivided into many smaller territories with autonomous judiciaries. As mentioned earlier, this stood in sharp contrast with the Spanish and Roman Inquisitions, which at the height of the witch hunt was considerably more sophisticated legal organisms and enforced a higher degree of skepticism and a disciplined approach. It also contrasts with countries such as England, which as well as being fairly centralised did not adopt inquisitional methodology and used a mixture of the old accusatory system and an early form of jury system. England's most vicious hunts occurred during the English Civil Wars, or the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, when these institutions had broken down and rogue witch hunters, most famously Matthew Hopkins, were able to use these otherwise forbidden techniques and methodologies with little to no scrutiny. The way torture was employed is at once both the result of an entirely alien logic, insofar as the authorities believed both that there were such things as demonic witches, and that there were specific beliefs about their bodies which meant that torture had to be applied in specific ways, and an all too familiar one, insofar as the torturers went in with preconceived ideas of the accused crimes, and would only accept answers they already expected. These two forms of logic inevitably were in conflict with one another. Those who could withstand the torture were normally set free, but the power of the devil's grasp over the witch and her resulting lack of susceptibility to pain provided justification for rules and restrictions to be ignored, and torture to be continued until the witch gave an answer that satisfied the interrogators. This often led to a dialectic of terror, where the accused witch would appeal to some common set of magical beliefs to try and explain away the accusations made against her, only for the interrogator to repurpose her answers into something more sinister, going back and forth until this produced a resulting image of guilt. Any answer that was not a denial sooner or later would become a confession. So was the witch hunt simply the result of zealous prosecutors with little accountability? No, this is simply a single dimension of an expansive subject for which there is no single explanation. But the legal dimension brings a disruptive idea sharply into focus. The world that hunted witches shares more with the present than we might think. In the early 2000s, arguments over the legality and use of torture for another kind of ambiguous threat in the form of terror suspects led to frequent cases of abhorrent abuse by the British and American militaries, both in the countries they invaded and occupied, and the places they extracted enemy combatants to. Almost 2 decades later, the world's most famous torture chamber, Guantanamo Bay, remains open, despite the majority of its detainees being released without trial. Rationality is only as strong as what it is applied in service of. But the dreams of reason can produce monsters, and we can easily forget that such monsters reside only in dreams.